Will the United States authorize land strikes on Venezuela, and is it truly preparing to remove Nicolás Maduro from power, as he claims? How does one even answer a question like that? If there were plans for a military strike, who would openly confirm it? Yet as tensions with Venezuela continue to escalate, President Trump has, in many ways, pulled back the curtain on what appears to be a renewed strategy aimed at pressuring Maduro's government from multiple angles. At the same time, the United States is moving forward with the return of hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan nationals whose temporary protected status has recently expired. This reverse migration is expected to place enormous strain on an already unstable country, a nation many now describe as being on the brink of open conflict. Alongside this, the president has intensified his rhetoric toward Caracas, openly floating the possibility of action on Venezuelan soil in the near future. Earlier today on Truth Social, he issued a warning to pilots and traffickers, declaring that the airspace above Venezuela should now be considered closed. From the Venezuelan government's perspective, everything happening against their country is portrayed as part of a broader plot to justify war, enforce regime change, and seize their vast oil wealth. Is this really about removing President Maduro? According to the administration, this is about far more than just one man. Officials argue that Venezuela has allowed its prisons to be emptied into the United States, that people from mental institutions were sent across the border, and that now the process is being reversed. Families across America are reeling from the speed at which these changes are taking place. One woman, among the 260,000 Venezuelans who relied on temporary protected status, now faces the reality of becoming undocumented overnight. The question remains, are Maduro's days as president numbered? Many analysts believe the answer is yes. If he were to surrender power, the next question would be where he might go. Some speculate the Middle East, others suggest Russia, but there is another perspective gaining traction, that Maduro would not need to flee at all if he simply shut down the criminal networks allegedly operating under his protection. It is widely claimed that Maduro is not only tied to the so-called Cartel of the Suns, but also to transnational gangs, with operations extending as far as major American cities like Chicago. These groups are accused of financing the luxurious lifestyles of those in power, while ordinary Venezuelans suffer in poverty, far removed from any version of the American dream. Now, with the expiration of legal protections for more than 200,000 Venezuelans living in the United States, many will be forced to return home. That sudden population surge alone could destabilize Maduro's grip on power. Add to that the mounting military pressures from the United States, and the situation grows even more volatile. For decades, Venezuela's political system has been stacked against its own people. A massive influx of returning citizens, especially those who have experienced life and freedom abroad, could overwhelm the existing structure and potentially trigger the collapse of the current regime. Such a collapse would likely pave the way for a reorganization of government that does not include a long-standing cartel leadership at the top. This, supporters of the strategy argue, is the true reason behind the intense pressure now being applied. The people of Venezuela deserve a future free from corruption and crime, and if criminal networks are dismantled at their source, the rest of the world benefits as well. Countries that serve as sanctuaries for fugitives and organized crime do not promote global peace or stability. They export violence and chaos wherever their networks spread. Consider what recently happened in Hawaii. According to local authorities in Kauai County, 6 federal search warrants led to the arrest of 44 individuals across several homes and a business. Among them were 2 suspected associates of a Venezuela-based terrorist organization. That prompted a pressing question. How do operatives from Venezuela end up in a place as remote as Hawaii? While the vast majority of Venezuelan nationals in the United States came seeking safety and opportunity, officials argue that weak vetting at the southern border allowed criminals to exploit the situation. As a result, dangerous networks have now reached nearly every corner of the nation. President Trump has repeatedly stated that Venezuela's government has acted in bad faith toward the United States. He claims they empty their jails into American communities and sent people the country was unprepared to handle. While many TV statements as controversial, supporters argue that decisive action is long overdue. For years, Venezuela's leadership enabled criminals to cross borders freely, while ordinary citizens lived under the grip of those same criminals. Now the narrative suggests that those days are ending. The Maduro government appears increasingly cornered, with growing talk that the president himself may soon flee the country. Reports have surfaced alleging that Maduro quietly explored the idea of departure with close family members and senior officials. Whether or not those reports are accurate, the ultimate objective seems to be pressuring him into making that decision himself or through the counsel of his inner circle. Skeptics argue that Maduro likely surrounds himself only with advisors who echo his own desires. Still, with Venezuela's airspace effectively closed and maritime surveillance intensifying, a country rich in resources but poor in stability is now frozen in economic and logistical limbo. A nation cannot function when its skies and waterways are sealed. Supporters of this pressure campaign argue that criminals attempting to operate under these conditions will be left with only two choices: surrender or face overwhelming force. Many are surprised that widespread capitulation has not already occurred. So, does Maduro have any realistic leverage left? Some believe he may attempt to use Venezuela's oil as a bargaining chip. It remains the country's most valuable resource. Yet, critics argue that his regime has already destroyed the credibility of that leverage. Venezuela nationalized its oil industry in 1976, seizing control of dozens of private companies, including subsidiaries of major international corporations. Private assets were taken over, and investor trust evaporated. Because of that history, few believe foreign companies would risk returning under the current government's control. Meanwhile, just next door in Guyana, massive oil development is taking place through international partnerships. Guyana has remained open to global business, and the result is rapidly growing prosperity without military occupation or coercion. This contrast fuels the argument that Venezuela's true obstacle is not foreign interference, but internal governance. If Venezuela were governed by a leadership that valued transparency, free enterprise, and peace, the same kind of prosperity could be achieved. But for that to happen, the current power structure would have to be dismantled. Maduro continues to claim that the United States seeks his removal to steal Venezuela's massive oil and gas reserves. He also relies on military backing from allies such as Russia, while ordering troop mobilizations across the country. To critics, this is a familiar pattern of authoritarian survival. History shows that countries natural resources do not automatically become wealthy. Under authoritarian socialism, Venezuela became a cautionary tale. Despite once being one of Latin America's richest nations, it now struggles to provide basic necessities to its people. More than 250,000 Venezuelans were granted refuge in the United States because their homeland had fallen into economic freefall. Now, as many prepare to return, the question arises: can the country handle that shock? And will a population that has tasted freedom be willing to live once again under an iron-fisted dictatorship? Some observers compare the current situation to past U.S. interventions in Panama and Haiti, where regime change operations did not turn into decades-long wars. Supporters argue that Venezuela could follow a similar path without large-scale troop deployments. Others urge caution, pointing to past conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, where objectives became unclear and consequences stretch on for generations. They argue that if action is taken, it must be based on transparent evidence and clearly defined outcomes. Those advocating military pressure counter that Venezuela is different. They argue that precision strikes targeting Cartel infrastructure could dismantle criminal operations rapidly without widespread civilian harm. With modern surveillance, intelligence, and satellite technology, they claim such operations could be swift and decisive. In that scenario, they believe Maduro would have little reason to stay. Once the criminal networks propping up his regime were neutralized, his departure could follow almost immediately. To them, the naval forces and air patrols now livable in the region are not meant for symbolic display. They are meant to send one clear message: voluntary exit is the safest remaining option. The argument continues that regime change in Venezuela would not be unprecedented. Past U.S. presidents have intervened in the Western Hemisphere with the declared aim of restoring democratic governance. Supporters say the same principle applies here. They also note that the international community recently recognized a Venezuelan opposition figure with one of the world's highest peace honors. This, they argue, stands in contrast to a government accused of corruption, repression, and drug trafficking. Yet critics within the United States continue to dispute the narrative, downplaying the severity of conditions inside Venezuela and rejecting the label of dictatorship. Supporters respond that decades of economic collapse, mass migration, and political repression speak louder than any ideological argument. At this stage, most agree on one point: much of what happens next lies in Maduro's own hands. He could end the crisis by stepping aside. But few believe that last-minute promises of reform would be trusted by either the international community or his